The trucks rattled down the dirt road, their tires spitting mud as they approached the camp. Inside, dozens of German women, auxiliaries, nurses, clerks, sat with stiff backs and defiant eyes. Their uniforms were wrinkled, their boots worn thin, but they carried themselves with a posture meant to disguise fatigue as pride. When the gates swung open, the women expected grim silence, perhaps barking orders, maybe even blows. Instead, they saw rows of American guards standing casually at ease, rifles resting on shoulders, helmets tilted back. One guard chewed gum lazily, blowing a bubble that popped with a sharp crack. Another leaned on his rifle as though it were a broom handle. To the German prisoners, trained to see enemies as disciplined machines, the sight was absurd. A ripple of laughter spread among them. One whispered in German, "These are the men who conquered us?" Another smirked, pointing out the guard with his sleeves rolled up, showing muscled forearms that seemed more fit for farm work than war. The Americans glanced at each other, but did not react with anger. One even grinned sheepishly, as though amused by their mocking stares. This was not the fierce punishment they had been taught to expect. It was something stranger, almost human. The laughter grew bolder. A nurse giggled behind her hand when a young GI tripped slightly on uneven ground. Others snickered at their accents, at the way the men spoke loudly and casually, so different from the rigid formality of the Wehrmacht. But beneath the laughter, confusion simmered. Why did these guards not retaliate? Why did they not strike back? Their patience unnerved the women more than cruelty would have. Cruelty could be understood. Tolerance was harder to explain. One prisoner, a brunette barely 20, studied the face of a tall guard as he passed. He had freckles across his nose and blue eyes that flicked toward her briefly. Instead of scorn, there was something like curiosity. She turned away quickly, her stomach tightening with emotions she refused to name. That evening, the women were marched to their barracks. Inside, the wooden bunk smelled faintly of sawdust and soap. Through the small window, they could still see the guards outside, laughing softly among themselves, sharing cigarettes under the dim lantern light. The German women lay on their bunks, whispering in low voices. Some mocked the guards again, calling them overgrown boys. Others scoffed at their casualness, declaring them unfit to be soldiers. Yet as the night deepened, the laughter faded into uneasy silence. For all their ridicule, none could forget the strangeness of the day. No beatings, no threats, only young men who seemed less like conquerors and more like ordinary workers in uniform. The brunette nurse stared at the ceiling, hearing muffled laughter outside. It was not cruel laughter, not mocking, but light-hearted, almost careless. She hated that it made her wonder what kind of lives these Americans lived before the war. She turned on her side, pulling the thin blanket over her shoulder. In the darkness, she whispered to herself, "Fools. They're fools." Yet her heart beat faster when she remembered those blue eyes. The women had arrived expecting monsters. Instead, they found men who smiled. They laughed to mask their unease, but in secret, the first cracks of curiosity had already begun. What began in ridicule would, in time, turn into something far more dangerous. Dreams they could not admit aloud. Morning broke with the clang of the camp bell. The German women lined up for roll call, still carrying themselves with defiance. Some whispered jokes under their breath as the guards moved along the rows, checking names against their lists. One prisoner nudged another and snickered at the guard with his helmet, tilted too far back, almost sliding off. Another whispered about the soldier whose boots looked mismatched. Laughter rippled again, but it was thinner now, edged with unease. The Americans didn't lash out. They simply continued their work, calm and indifferent. One guard even smirked when he overheard the women laughing, as if acknowledging the absurdity of the situation himself. For the German women, this lack of anger was unsettling. They had been raised on stories of merciless enemies, trained to believe capture meant humiliation. But these men didn't humiliate them. They ignored the mockery with almost casual patience. Inside, doubt began to stir. If the enemy was not cruel, then what did that mean about everything they had been told? Laughter, once a shield, now felt flimsy. Later that day, the women were marched to the camp kitchens to collect food. The smell of bacon and coffee wafted from the building. One woman laughed loudly, pretending to gag. "This is what they eat?" she sneered. The others joined in. But when the trays were handed out, steaming with eggs and fresh bread, the laughter faltered. Hunger gnawed at their pride. They ate quickly, pretending to dislike it. But the warmth of the food betrayed their words. One guard noticed and smiled faintly, as if he saw through the act. He made no comment, but the silence was heavier than scolding would have been. The women exchanged glances, cheeks hot with shame they could not admit. That night, gathered in their barracks, the talk turned from ridicule to confusion. Some still mocked the guards, but others fell quiet, staring at the floor. One finally whispered, "Why do they not hate us?" No one had an answer. The brunette nurse lay awake again, staring at the ceiling. She thought of the guard with freckles. She had laughed at him earlier with the others, calling him a boy. Yet when he handed her food, his hands had not trembled with malice, but with a quiet steadiness. She remembered his eyes again, that fleeting glance. It wasn't scorn, it wasn't victory. It was something else, something dangerously close to kindness. The thought made her chest tighten. She buried her face in her blanket, whispering angrily to herself, "Foolish. Dangerous. Do not think this way," but the image stayed, burning. The laughter of the first day was already losing its edge. What had begun as mockery was turning into unease, and beneath that unease stirred something far more dangerous, curiosity. The women told themselves they were only prisoners, that these men were only guards. That laughter kept them safe. But in the stillness of night, when no one spoke, their hearts betrayed them with unspoken questions, and questions, once born, could not be silenced. The following week, routines settled in. Roll calls, meals, work details. The women kept their defiant posture, but the sharpness of their laughter had dulled. Now they watched more closely. At the kitchens, one guard carried a crate of bread and nearly dropped it. Instead of anger, he laughed at himself, muttering something in English that made his comrades chuckle. The sound was light, human, unthreatening. A young German clerk smirked at first, whispering to the woman beside her, "Clumsy Americans." But when she glanced again, she noticed how easily they laughed at themselves. A habit unfamiliar in her own world of strict hierarchy. Later, during work assignments, one prisoner struggled to carry a bucket of water. She braced for the bark of an order or mockery. Instead, an American stepped forward, took the other handle, and carried it with her to the barracks. The women exchanged stunned looks. No soldier they had known would have done such a thing. The German officers had demanded obedience, never offering help. But here was an enemy who shared the burden, silently, without demand. That night, the women whispered about it. Some scoffed, saying it was only strategy, a trick to win their trust. But one admitted quietly, "I cannot remember the last time a man helped me without wanting something in return." The brunette nurse thought of the freckled guard again. When he passed her in the yard, he nodded politely. A gesture so simple it left her unsettled. It was not a leer, not a command, not a threat, just acknowledgement. She caught herself replaying it as she lay in her bunk, heart racing at the absurdity. Why should a nod matter? Why should kindness feel more dangerous than cruelty? The women began to notice other small gestures. A guard leaving extra bread on a tray. Another adjusting a blanket over a prisoner who had fallen asleep on the grass. No one spoke of these things aloud, but everyone noticed. Laughter, once their weapon, began to falter. It was harder to laugh when they felt warmth rising in their chests, warmth they didn't want to acknowledge. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the barbed wire gold, the women watched the guards play cards outside their hut. They laughed together, teasing one another, their voices carrying on the breeze. The German women stared silently, some with longing they didn't admit. For the first time, they saw their captors not as faceless soldiers, but as men. Young, clumsy, full of life, perhaps even capable of affection. The brunette pressed her forehead against the wooden wall, listening to the echoes of their laughter. She whispered to herself, "They are not supposed to be like this." But her heart betrayed her with another thought, one she would never dare speak. What if they are better than the men we followed into war? And with that, laughter gave way to silence, and silence gave way to longing. By the second month in captivity, the camp had settled into a strange rhythm. The women no longer laughed openly at the Americans. Instead, they stole glances, quick and fleeting, as though afraid to be caught looking. One afternoon, while distributing supplies, a guard handed a young prisoner a blanket. Their fingers brushed for the briefest instant. He smiled, not mockingly, not commandingly, but warmly. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. That smile haunted her through the night. She told herself it was nothing, just habit, just a meaningless expression. But in a world where cruelty had been the rule, a smile was more dangerous than any rifle. The women whispered among themselves after lights out. One said she had seen a guard carve a small wooden figure, leaving it on a windowsill for whoever might find it. Another admitted she caught a soldier humming a German tune, softly under his breath. Such things felt almost forbidden. They blurred the line between captor and captive. What did it mean if the enemy could show kindness? What did it mean if their smiles warmed instead of wounded? The brunette nurse found herself in the yard one day, hanging laundry alongside others. The freckled guard passed by, nodding again, his blue eyes soft beneath his helmet. This time, she couldn't stop herself. She smiled back. It was the smallest curve of her lips, but the effect was immediate. Her heart raced, her hands trembled, and she looked away as quickly as she could. Still, she knew he had noticed. That evening, she scolded herself, whispering into her blanket, "Fool. You are a fool?" Yet the warmth of that exchange stayed with her, stubborn as a flame refusing to die. The laughter that once filled the barracks at night was gone. Now there was silence, and within that silence, the weight of unspoken thoughts. Each woman carried her own secret. The memory of a glance, a word, a smile. Some still mocked the Americans openly, but their voices rang hollow. The others no longer joined in, afraid their own hearts might betray them. The camp had become a paradox. Barbed wire and freedom intertwined, duty and desire colliding in the quiet spaces between chores. When the guards played cards outside again, the women didn't laugh at them. Instead, they listened. Every burst of laughter, every shouted joke, every strum of a harmonica seeped through the air like forbidden music. The brunette sat on her bunk, her face hidden in shadow. She whispered into the silence, "It is dangerous to smile." But I did. And for the first time, she wondered not just what it meant to be captured, but what it meant to be seen. Danger was no longer in guns or fences. It was in smiles that lingered too long, and in hearts that refused to obey the rules of war. Nights in the camp were quiet, broken only by the hum of insects and the occasional call of a guard on watch. But inside the women's barracks, whispers began to weave through the darkness. They whispered about the guards, not with mockery now, but with curiosity. One woman confessed she had dreamed of an American offering her flowers. Another admitted she caught herself staring at the way one soldier's hands moved when he played cards. At first, these confessions were met with nervous laughter. But the laughter was soft, almost guilty, nothing like the sharp ridicule of their first days. The women lowered their voices, afraid the walls might hear. The brunette nurse lay awake, listening. When her turn came, she said nothing. But in her heart, she replayed the moment she had smiled back at the freckled guard. She remembered the way his eyes lit, the quiet acknowledgement that had passed between them. Every night, the whispers grew bolder. The women spoke of kindnesses they had noticed. A guard who offered extra bread, another who lent his jacket to a shivering prisoner during work detail. These small gestures became treasures, stored away like contraband. But along with curiosity came fear. They all knew the rules of their upbringing. German women were to despise the enemy, to hold themselves as symbols of loyalty and discipline. To feel otherwise was dangerous, even shameful. One night, a woman whispered, "What if they think of us the same way?" The question hung heavy in the air. No one answered. Yet every woman in the barracks silently wondered. The brunette nurse pulled her blanket tighter, heart racing. She wanted to scoff, to silence the thought. But instead, another voice rose inside her. What if he dreams of me the way I dream of him? Outside, the Americans sat by the fire, their laughter drifting into the night air. It sounded different now, not threatening, not foolish, but warm. The women lay still, listening as though the sound itself were a secret meant for them. Sometimes a harmonica played. The music seeped through the darkness like water through cracks, filling the barracks with longing they dared not name. The women closed their eyes and tried to sleep. But dreams betrayed them. Dreams of smiles, of voices, of futures that could never be. And in the morning they woke ashamed, silent, unable to meet each other's eyes. For laughter was gone, replaced by something they could neither resist nor admit: desire. Desire that crept in slowly, fed by whispers, growing stronger with every glance, every gesture, every smile. They were prisoners of war. Yet in the quiet of night, they had become prisoners of their own hearts, and that was a captivity far more dangerous than barbed wire. It happened during a late afternoon roll call. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the gravel yard. The women stood in their lines, weary from another day of chores. The brunette nurse shifted her weight, brushing loose hair from her face. When she looked up, she found the freckled guard watching her. Not in the way men in town squares once had, not with hunger, but with something gentler, quieter. Their eyes met for only a second before she dropped her gaze. Yet in that instant, her heart raced. She could feel his glance like a touch, impossible to deny. The guard said nothing. His expression was unreadable to others, but she caught it. The faintest flicker of warmth, the suggestion that he saw her not as prisoner, not as enemy, but as a woman. That evening, as they marched back to the barracks, the whispers returned. One woman teased her softly, saying the guard had looked at her too long. The nurse blushed, shaking her head, insisting it was nothing. But inside, she knew it was not nothing. Later, while serving stew in the mess, another guard offered a prisoner an extra ladle. A simple gesture, unnoticed by most, but the women caught it. Every kindness now carried weight, interpreted as signs, as hidden meanings. The camp had not changed. The barbed wire was still sharp, the rifles still loaded. But something beneath the surface had shifted. Attention had turned to glances, to tones of voice, to the smallest details. For the nurse, the guard's glance replayed endlessly in her mind. She remembered the way his jaw tightened, the way he tried not to stare, as though guarding himself as carefully as she guarded her heart. When she lay down that night, she closed her eyes and saw his face in the fading sunlight. She told herself it was foolish, dangerous, even treasonous to feel such things, and yet the warmth would not leave her. The women spoke in riddles now, their whispers coated with giggles and blushes. One said she wished she knew how to ask a guard his name. Another admitted she dreamed of dancing, of music, of a hand extended under moonlight. The nurse remained silent during these talks, but her silence said more than the words. Her friends noticed her faraway eyes, the way she lingered at the door during roll call. That glance had changed her. It was no longer laughter, no longer mockery. It was something far more dangerous, hope. Hope that maybe the barbed wire did not separate enemies, but two lives that might have touched differently in another world. The harmonica played again outside that night, and as its notes floated into the barracks, she thought of the glance, of the unspoken promise hidden within it. And she knew with a shiver that this was only the beginning. The change began with whispers, but whispers turned daring. One evening after supper, as dusk sank into the camp, a German woman named Elsa lingered near the fence, clutching a folded scrap of paper. She had written it secretly on the back of a supply list, smuggled from the kitchens. Just a few words, broken English stitched together. If war over, marry. Her hands shook as she passed it quietly to a guard who often stood near the mess. He looked down, startled, then met her eyes. His face flushed, and for a moment silence thickened around them. The women watching from the barracks held their breath. They knew what she had done. It was reckless, dangerous. Yet every heart pounded with the same question. What if he said yes? The guard unfolded the paper, reading the shaky handwriting. He exhaled slowly, then handed it back, shaking his head. His lips pressed together, not cruel, not mocking, just firm. Elsa's face crumbled. She tucked the paper into her apron and hurried away, her eyes stinging with shame. The women whispered that night, torn between pity and envy. She had been brave enough to ask what they all secretly wondered. But rejection echoed louder than courage. The nurse, listening in silence, felt both relief and despair. Relief that it had not been her. Despair that perhaps none of their hidden hopes would ever be answered. The guards, too, were unsettled. They joked nervously among themselves, but beneath the laughter lay unease. To them, fraternization was forbidden, dangerous, a betrayal of duty. And yet how could they not notice the glances, the smiles, the longing eyes? That night, Elsa wept quietly into her blanket. She had dreamed just for a moment that barbed wire could dissolve, that war could give way to love. The answer she received was not cruel. It was worse. It was final. The other women tried to comfort her, whispering that perhaps the guard had feared punishment, not her. But even so, the truth stung. Their hearts had been reminded of their place. Prisoners, not brides. The nurse lay awake long after, her fingers tracing the knots in the wooden ceiling. She thought of the guard's glance again. Was it real? Or was she fooling herself, weaving romance into shadows? Outside, the harmonica played again, soft and uncertain. This time, the tune felt different, almost mournful. As if the music, too, knew the danger of dreaming too much. The women fell asleep uneasy, their hearts split between desire and dread. For every glance that stirred warmth, there was the cold reminder of rejection waiting behind it. And yet, even with Elsa's humiliation fresh in their minds, the dangerous thought refused to die. Perhaps, just perhaps, someone would say yes. But none of them yet understood love in a prison camp was not only forbidden, it was a weapon, one that could wound both sides. The rejection had silenced their laughter for days. Elsa's bold attempt had ended not with romance, but with shame, and yet it had awakened something that none of them could bury again. The women found themselves watching more closely. The way one soldier adjusted his helmet absent-mindedly, the way another leaned back in his chair and laughed at a comrade's joke, the sweat glistening on their forearms after patrols. They were not faceless enemies anymore. They were men, young, tired, sometimes clumsy men who seemed closer to farm boys than monsters. The women tried to suppress their thoughts, but at night, lying beneath thin blankets, imaginations betrayed discipline. They dreamed of what it might mean to be chosen, to be wanted not as captives, but as women. The nurse in particular felt the conflict burn inside her. She told herself it was foolish, dangerous, even dishonorable. And yet when one guard lingered near her, his boots planted firmly in the dust, she felt her pulse quicken. He said nothing, but his glance lingered a fraction too long, enough to stir in her chest the ache of possibility. The silence between captives and guards grew thick, charged. A laugh shared over spilled stew, a glance that lasted a heartbeat too long. None dared cross the invisible line, but everyone felt it. The women began to whisper less of hunger and more of hope. Did you see the way he smiled? Did you notice how he looked when she sang? Their voices carried the tremor of forbidden longing. For the soldiers, too, there was unease. They knew the rules, written in thick black ink in military codes. But rules did little to stop human hearts from stirring when a prisoner's eyes softened. When a laugh cracked the wall of silence, some guards avoided eye contact altogether, afraid of what might be revealed. Others grew clumsy, fumbling with keys or stammering greetings, as though battling with feelings they could not name. It was a war of glances, of silences, of half-formed dreams that neither side dared to speak aloud. One night the women lay awake in their bunks, the harmonica drifting again across the camp. This time the tune was softer, tender, almost like a lullaby. Some closed their eyes and let it carry them into dreams not of war, but of weddings, dances, homes that no longer existed. The line between fantasy and reality blurred. Barbed wire still gleamed outside, but inside their minds, the fences fell away. Yet longing carried its own weight. It was not enough to look. It was not enough to dream. Every whispered desire collided with the truth. They were still prisoners, and love was not theirs to claim. And so they remained in silence, hearts reaching across a gulf they could never cross, fearing that even to hope was already too dangerous. It began with a quarrel no one expected. Two women, usually allies in their shared suffering, erupted into harsh whispers one morning over nothing more than a scrap of cloth. The others stared in silence, realizing quickly the cloth was not the real cause. The real cause was jealousy. Both had noticed the same soldier's lingering kindness. Both had mistaken it for something more. The tension spread like fire through dry grass. Quiet longing had turned into rivalry, and rivalry threatened to shatter the fragile unity that kept them steady. One guard noticed the argument. He stepped forward, not with anger, but with confusion, unsure why these women who laughed together now glared with venom. His attempt at broken German, peace, peace, only deepened their shame. Later that evening, the camp was restless. Conversations that once circled around food now circled around forbidden love. Did you see how he touched her hand? No, it was an accident. But what if it wasn't? The whispers tore at their discipline. They were still prisoners. Yet their hearts behaved like free women, daring to hope for something they knew could not be theirs. For the soldiers, too, the tension grew heavy. One sergeant caught his men laughing too freely near the women and barked an order to keep distance. He feared scandal, feared rumors that could travel farther than bullets. But fear could not silence the glances. A smile passed through the barbed wire like contraband. A soldier lingered too long when delivering bread. A woman smoothed her hair, pretending it was accident, though every motion carried intent. The breaking point came not with violence, but with music. The red-haired soldier drew his harmonica again, this time playing a tune that sounded heartbreakingly tender. The notes floated through the dusk, soft and aching. One woman, unable to stop herself, began to hum along. Her voice was low, hesitant, but it carried across the compound. The others froze, waiting for punishment. None came. Instead, the soldier's tune softened to meet her voice, as though weaving their sounds together. The others watched, stunned, as prisoner and guard created something forbidden, something fragile. When the song ended, silence fell heavy. No one spoke. The soldier looked away quickly, tucking the harmonica into his pocket, his face flushed. The woman turned her head, ashamed of the tears on her cheeks. In that silence, everyone knew a line had been crossed, not in action, but in desire. It was the kind of crossing that could not be undone.